I'll be showing you how to draft a button placket sewing pattern and how to sew a button placket to your clothes. How to make a button placket sewing pattern. Okay, so I'm starting with a clean copy of my pattern block, and then from there I'm going to decide which button I want to use, and then I measured the button and it's 1 inch wide. I wanted to show you guys that I added seam allowance to my pattern along the bottom, the side, the armhole, the shoulder, and the neckline, but not along the center front. From the center front line, I measured and marked 1.25 inches. I added an extra quarter because even though my button is 1 inch wide, I wanted my button to have some extra space on the placket. You can choose how wide you want your button placket to be. So starting from the line that I just drew, I'm going to create a second column that's the same width as this first column, which for me is 1.25 inches. So I measured and marked 1.25 inches, and then I'm just going to extend that mark all the way down to the full length of the center front of the pattern. Then I connected the top of the 2 vertical lines to the rest of the pattern, and I also connected the seam allowance line as well. And I did that for both the top and the bottom of the vertical lines. At this point, I have seam allowance all along the neckline, the shoulder, the side, and the bottom. So I'm just adding a 1/2 inch seam allowance to the side of the button placket, like so. You could leave your button placket pattern like this, or if you wanted, you could separate the button placket by cutting down the center front line like this, and then you have a separate button placket piece, but you'd have to remember to add seam allowance to the center front, and then seam allowance to the cut side of the button placket. Now I'm going to make the buttonholes to add to the pattern. Since the diameter of my button is 1 inch, I'm going to add a 1/4 inch, making my buttonhole 1.25 inches long. The next thing I have to calculate is the combined length of all of the buttonholes. So since I have 4 buttonholes, that would be 4 times 1.25 each, so the combined length is 5 inches for me. Now I have to calculate the leftover placket space, and in order to do that, I start with measuring the full length of my placket, excluding seam allowance, so that for me is 9 inches. Then I'm going to take that 9 inches and subtract 5 inches because 5 inches is the combined length of all of my buttonholes. So my remaining placket space is 4 inches. The final thing that I'll need to calculate is how much space I'll need to put between each buttonhole marking. And this is what I mean by the number of spaces between the buttons. And this is the most important calculation. If you don't want to do the calculations, you can use a sewing gauge to more quickly and accurately measure the buttonhole spaces. To make the buttonhole markings, I started by finding the midpoint on the first buttonhole column, and I did this by folding my measuring tape in half where the first column is, and then making a mark where the fold of the measuring tape is. And then I repeated this step along the middle and the bottom of the first column. And this is what my 3 marks looked like. Then I took my ruler and I lined it up along the marks that I made, and then drew a straight line to connect the 3 marks. And the line that I made is very light because I'm going to be erasing some parts of the line. Then slightly below the seam allowance line, I made a small horizontal mark, and this will be where the start of the buttonhole is. And then I erased all parts of the buttonhole line above this horizontal mark that I just made. Then starting at that horizontal mark that I just made, I measured 1.25 inches, which is the length of my buttonhole, and then I made another small horizontal mark along that 1.25 inch measurement. And then I just darkened that 1.25 inch line, and this is what the first buttonhole looks like. Starting from that second horizontal mark, I measured my button spacing measurement, which was 1.3 inches. Honestly, I'm not sure where 1.3 inches would be on a measuring tape, so I just guesstimated and made a mark near the 3/8 line. So starting from the previous mark, I measured 1.25 inches, which is the length of my buttonhole, and then I made another small horizontal mark. And then I basically just darkened the buttonhole line between those 2 marks with a vertical line like so. And so that I wouldn't get confused, I erased the draft buttonhole line between the two buttonhole marks that I just made. After that, I just repeated these steps in order to create the rest of the buttonholes. And then I labeled my pattern like so. Usually when you make something with buttons, you'd have to cut two pieces. So one piece would have just the buttonhole markings, and then another pattern piece would have just the buttonhole placement, which are the circled X's. How to sew a button placket to a garment. I started by tracing and cutting out my pattern pieces. If your button placket is already included in your front bodice pattern as one piece, you can skip the next step. But if you have a separate button placket piece like this, then you can start by cutting a matching interfacing piece for the placket. I don't have interfacing, so I used this pattern fabric to represent the interfacing. I put my placket on top of the edge of the front bodice piece with right sides facing, and then I straight stitched along the seam allowance line, and now I have one pattern piece. Then I trimmed off some of the fabric along the seam allowance so that about 3/8 of an inch of fabric was left. And then with the fabric wrong side up, I pressed the seam allowance fabric towards the other edge of the front placket. Next, I folded and pressed the edge of the placket along the seam allowance. If your seam allowance is more than 3/8 of an inch, you can trim it down so that it's 3/8 of an inch. Otherwise, leave it as is. Then I turned the fabric right side facing up, and I folded the placket so that the folded edge was at the very top. Then I straight stitched along the seam allowance line at the bottom of my shirt, and it looked like this. After that, I trimmed the fabric below the stitches, leaving about 1/4 of an inch of fabric to prevent bulking. And I stopped cutting where the folded edge of the placket connects with the bodice. Then I flipped the placket right side out by pushing in the wrong side of the fabric until only the right sides of the placket were showing. With the fabric wrong side up, I placed the folded edge of the placket on top of the seam allowance line and pressed it down to keep it flat. And then I hand stitched a horizontal basting stitch along the seam allowance line at the top of the placket. Before this next step, the shirt should have the neckband and the collar attached and be pretty much assembled, so we'll pretend that that's the case. Next, I'll edge stitch around all edges of the placket. Then I'll repeat the previous steps for the other front bodice piece. We'll need 2 plackets, one for the buttons and one for the buttonholes. Once the placket is sewn onto both bodice pieces, the next thing to do is transfer the marks for the buttons and the buttonholes, and then install the buttons and the buttonholes. You're probably wondering how to make a buttonhole and how to add buttons. Don't worry, I got you. This video right here will show you how to sew a flat button and a shank button by hand and with a sewing machine, and also how to sew a buttonhole with and without a buttonhole foot. So check it out.